Hello, everyone. Welcome to the morning show. We're coming to you this morning on WJOP LP Newburyport at FM 96.3, on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube channel at ncmhub.org, and on Channel 9. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I'm just so pleased this morning to be able to welcome author Suzanne DeWitt Hall here to talk about her debut novel, The Language of Bodies. Suzanne has written other nonfiction books as well, which we'll talk about later in the interview. But first, let's start just by saying welcome, Suzanne, and thank you so much for taking time to visit the morning show.
Oh, Mary, thanks for having me. I'm extremely excited to talk to you and to talk about this book.
Well, likewise. I thought we might start. I know that you have close connections with Newburyport in the past, and I believe there was a writers group in Newburyport that might have helped launch this book. So tell us about your connection with Newburyport to begin with.
Yes, so we lived there. We moved away from the region about 5 years ago, and we moved to Newburyport from New York State, and it was like after a bunch of chaos in our lives, and it was like coming to some sort of reward to be able to live
I know the feeling.
You know, it's so packed with beauty and culture and literary connections and wonderful writers. And so I've found a writing group, the Newburyport Writers Group, and started attending those events and making friendships and feeding off of the discussion about writing and the encouragement. Holly Robinson was influential in encouraging me. She's just an encouraging person and fun. Nancy Crochet, there's name, Donna Same. There's name after name after name of these local writers who I was blessed to spend time with. And we were, my spouse and I were married in St. Paul's Church in Newburyport. I volunteered at the Emma Andrews Library, and I created a historical, what do you call them? So I created a persona and did a living history presentation based on Emma for them. And, so Newburyport is deeply, deeply in our hearts.
Well, and it's connected to your book as well, because you're going to have a book launch celebration at St. Paul's, familiar territory for you and your spouse. That will be on October 14th at 7 p.m. And we'll be sure to mention that again at the end. Well, congratulations again on your debut novel, Suzanne. I know it's not easy to get published these days, so good for you. And it's a propulsive story. Wally Lamb called it a film noir between covers, which is pretty evocative. It follows the cascading trail of damage that a gruesome murder leaves behind in its wake. Please sketch out the storyline for us and tell us about what drew you to develop this story, Suzanne.
Yes, so it is the story of a woman's path of journey, her journey of vengeance after her wife was murdered. Her wife was a transgender woman of color. And unfortunately, that is a crime that happens all too often in our culture and in other cultures around the world. So Maddie kind of travels to where the murder occurred and targets the perpetrator's wife as the source for her, a way to work out her anger and her grief and her guilt. And so it's kind of I'm laughing because it sounds terribly dark, but there's a lot of humor in it, and sort of how following her path is both harrowing and humorous. It's an odd story. It's an odd mix with lots of odd elements. And did you ask why I wrote it? I'm sorry, I can't remember.
Yes, what drew you to develop this particular story?
I find that settings are very, they're kind of act as muses for me. So in traveling around Missouri, there were several settings that struck me. One of them was this idea of a wax museum. And I knew, and this sort of fetishization of Wild West characters whose stories are often not heroic,
Yeah.
but yet they're made American heroes. And Jesse James was one of those characters. And so I had this idea that I wanted to write with a setting of a wax museum, and I wanted sort of Jesse James and the theme of vengeance to be part of it, because vengeance is a big part of Jesse James' kickoff into crime. And I didn't have a framework otherwise. I knew that those two elements were things I wanted to include. And then also in Missouri, this young woman named Allie Steinfeld was brutally murdered and disfigured. And the shock of that story and reading about it propelled me into knowing I wanted to center on that as the action of a survivor taking vengeance.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I know we're going to talk about it some more, but most of my public work has been in advocacy for LGBTQ inclusion and affirmation. So, that those issues were already key to my heart. And when that happened, it sort of all came together that I knew I had to shine light on this issue and this problem.
So it was kind of a convergence of situations and circumstances and themes that led you to this story. And yeah, the Wax Museum does play a pivotal role. And I learned things about Jesse James I never knew. And you will learn those things when you read the book. And it fits beautifully then with the theme of revenge in the story, which is clearly so much related to the power of grief, which is also a huge part of what your book is about. The lingering effects of grief and the places grief can take us, which we might not have predicted, but which your main character discovers. They take her there, as well as the overarching themes of the book about different forms of violence and the vulnerability and the tragedy of just what can happen to transgendered people in this country. And we will talk more about that in a bit, but back to the book. There's two contrasting main characters really in the book, and one of them is the murderer, whose name is Chris Jackson in the book, and then Maddie, whom you mentioned, who's the wife of the transgendered woman who gets murdered. And to me, as I read the book, they appeared to portray the hazards, on the one hand, with the murderer, of gender insecurity and a kind of panic-induced violence on the one hand, and with Maddie, of course, as we've already talked about a bit, the temptations of revenge-induced violence. So talk to us a bit about what you wanted your characters to reveal about both of these dangers.
Yeah. Well, I didn't want to give too much attention to the perpetrator, because, it's not about heroicizing him in any way, the way that Jesse and those other characters have been, and the way many characters are, real life people. So I deal with him just in transcripts, these interview transcripts with the police when he's confessing. So they're just snippets that intersperse the story periodically, and provide some insight into what happened to Char, Maddie's wife, without having a scene which describes him doing this crime. Because again, I don't want the focus to be on the actions of violence. I wanted it to be on the lingering effects and the love, the deep, deep love. In many ways, this is a love story. It's an interrupted love story, but it's a love story about Maddie and Char. So what I was trying to show, as you're asking, is that I wanted to point out the Christian demonization of sexual orientation and gender identity, those spectrums, because Christopher basically has thoughts about his own sexuality that disturb him deeply because of his Christian training. And I wanted to, we'll talk about, I know we're going to talk about this some more. So I wanted to point out the demonization that happens without demonizing faith traditions generally. And so, like I said, we'll talk about that some more. In Maddie's case, I think that grief feels like there's so many shapes. It takes shapes, it morphs, it moves back and forth in cycles. It's many things. But I felt like it would be so big that it needed an outlet. And the cry for justice also rings in our heart. And we live in an era where there is so much, when injustice seems to be in our face all the time and we feel powerless.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so this character, with this hugeness of her grief, we meet her at a time when the sadness and where she has been immobilized for quite a while is transformed. There's something that happens that kicks off this spark of anger, and that anger ignites her and shoots her out into action. And that action is such a relief from having been stuffed into this powerlessness, that it gave her a focus. It was an inappropriate focus, but it gave her a focus and probably kept her alive, actually.
Oh, interesting way to put it. Yeah. Yeah. And the themes are very powerfully and thoughtfully developed in the book. And using the transcript of the interview after the interviews are kind of after the murderer has already been caught and is in jail. But it's very powerful. It's like a case study. It's like a psychological case study embedded within your novel, actually for both characters, but in a way that keeps it very compelling as you read along. And it is suspenseful because you're not quite sure how things are going to work out for Maddie, what possible path in her psyche she's going to follow. And I won't give a spoiler there. But I did also want to ask you about the role of race and religion in the narrative. You started talking about religion already, and it's clearly the background for the story. So Char, Maddie's transgendered wife, is a person of color, and there are elements of Catholic, in particular, mysticism that appear throughout. Tell us about what makes these choices integral to your story.
Well, I'm that sort of exploring what exists beyond what we can see and beyond what our brains can hold and beyond what we allow our reason to contemplate is something that fascinates me and that I've been writing about for a couple of decades, I suppose. And so it sort of saturates all my work one way or another. And when it comes to novels, it usually manifests itself in strange and interesting ways. So it was bound to do that in this book. But also, it does provide the contrast to what happens with Christopher. In a lot of Christian, I'm not super familiar with other faith traditions, although I know discrimination, religious-based discrimination obviously exists in many forms. In Christianity, there is this demonization, but I wanted to show that it doesn't have to be, that there are ways of feeling deeply connected to God. And even within a traditional faith culture, because this character, Maria, we'll talk about some more, is an Italian Roman Catholic woman, and she acts as a muse, and she introduces this large volumes of Catholic mysticism into the story. In addition, Char is a mixed heritage person. She's African American and Native American, and her grandmother was pulled into an indigenous school, and somehow retained a love of Catholicism that had been sort of forced into her. Char's mother, that woman's daughter, was full of rage about what had happened to her mother and fully rebellious and fully embracing her native heritage. And then here is Char, who is amalgamating these things. And she's also African American from the other side. And I think that is just reflective of our culture and where we're going, is that increasingly we're not, these sort of we're no longer a WASP nation where everything is sort of mixing in this beautiful, wonderful, fascinating, enriching way. And I wanted that reflected. Yeah, so I think we're going to talk a little bit more about it, Maria, and then we'll talk probably about some more mysticism stuff. But oh, one more thing on that is that I needed to find ways of punctuating the darkness of this story with light.
Yeah.
And I think that for me, trying to see beyond the veil is a way of doing that. Yeah, so it's one of the things that offers some hope and some light and some direction in the story.
Yeah, I like the way you put that, seeing beyond the veil. That's very poetic and visual. So I like that. And we need that inside stories and outside stories. So, well, yeah, please tell us more about the character of Maria then, who plays, she becomes a very good friend and something of a mentor, and maybe overstating it to say savior, but certainly a helpful figure for Maddie. So say a little bit more about how you constructed her character.
I picture Maria as the hero of the story, right? Maddie's the protagonist, and we've got Christopher the villain. Maria is the hero because she is this sage character. In all the hero's journey sorts of stories with the Hobbit or any of these stories, there's always this sage figure that the person goes to for advice as they're screwing up along the way. And Maria provides that function, but she's also just hilarious.
Yes.
Her use of language is funny because English is her second language, and so she says funny things inadvertently, but also just because of the way her mind works. She's very wise and very nurturing, but also she doesn't put up with nonsense.
Yeah.
She runs a junk shop, like a thrift store, but it's very sort of a junky junk shop, and has a cat named Clyde that she caters to. And yeah, so she plays this role of when Maddie is in places of darkness, she provides comfort. She provides some advice that Maddie often doesn't listen to. And she punctuates the story with that lightness and with the peering behind the veil, and just with laughter and love, which Maddie so desperately needs.
Yes, and she is both a kind of a practically wise person, but also a spiritual person. And you're right, she doesn't brook nonsense. She will just cut right to the chase, cut right to the heart of things, which so those are really bright spots, as you're saying, in a narrative that can take some very dark turns. Maddie does continually reach out to Maria, and those are bright spots, both because of the wisdom that's conveyed, but also because she does, as a non-native speaker, she uses language in some very entertaining ways. So
she's funny. She's interested in strange things.
Yes, yes, she is, and that store becomes almost a character in the book, because you portray it rather vividly, as Maddie is vivid, as Maria is vivid. The store itself is almost a character, because it's kind of an externalization of who Maria is. So I enjoyed that. Well done.
Good. Well, if you read my follow-on novels, I've got one, Christie Stories, my sophomore novel, and that'll be coming out shortly. And Maria is featured there too. So.
Oh, I'm glad to know that. Great, wonderful, and congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Well, I did want to talk to you about your other nonfiction books, because you have a number of them, and they clearly follow a strand of activism and passion for social justice that comes through in your novel as well. So please tell us about the Where True Love Is. I believe it's both a book and an affiliated movement. So tell us about that.
Yes. So my spouse and I were both profoundly, what would I say, right-leaning Christian when we met back in about 2008, 2009. And we were attending the same church. It was patriarchal. It had an all-male structure all the way up to a patriarchy. Very socially conservative. We were both married to men trying to be Proverbs 31 wives. And we became friends. And for a couple of years, we're friends. And then something shifted and we fell in love. And that was before my spouse, Declan, recognized his gender identity, that he is transgender. And so we were living these unhappy lives. And we broke out we embraced our love and left that church and started our life together because our marriages had been exploding and dissolving. And because of our faith formations, mine had been largely Roman Catholic, adult formed Roman Catholic. And Declan's had been, he was raised Methodist, but it was largely sort of Southern Baptist in flavor and Southern Baptist later on. We both were entrenched in what the Bible said about life generally, and social issues and things like sexuality were, hugely formed by scripture. And so we had to, because we knew that our love was profoundly good, and we saw the sacredness of it in a way we'd never seen in any other relationship. And we felt the blessedness of it and the approval, right? I mean, we felt like this sort of, now I would, the approval of the universe, or I don't have the same terminology that I would have used then. So that we felt and we saw the fruit of the Spirit, to use a Catholic phrase. So we knew that there was good, but it didn't make sense with what we had been taught. Yeah. And so we continued our daily Bible studies, and I took lots of notes, and Declan began reading lots of books about gay Christianity. And I started making notes on our discussions. And the book Where True Love Is came out of that. It's essentially, a pastor friend of ours called it a systematic theology, because it starts out saying, well, who is God, and what are scriptures, and what is sin, and what did Jesus say about the Bible, and all these questions, which finally lead up to the issues of sexuality and gender, because without that framework, it doesn't make sense to discuss it in a Christian context, although most people don't. So that book led then to a book called Transfigured, which is for a similar volume of a devotional. It's so short, I forgot to say this part. These books are short daily devotionals that give you something to chew on and move on from. You can contemplate throughout the day. The next one was Transfigured, and then so that's for trans and gender non-conforming people. Then I wrote one called I Don't Want Them to Go to Hell, which is for families and friends of people who are worried when their loved ones come out. And that led to just, all the other books. Eventually, one called Sex with God, which explores sexuality, sort of a sacred sexuality in a post-purity culture world. And as all that was happening, Declan is a tremendous force of online community building. He was building this Where True Love Is Facebook presence, which now reaches about 150 million people a month.
Which is extraordinary, just extraordinary and wonderful. But that speaks to the need.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, people are just so hungry for affirming messaging and to be told that they are perfect the way they are, that they are beloved, that they are worthy.
Yeah.
And so over this past year, the numbers have just been, increasing, like nearly 100,000 followers every month and a half. It's been extremely interesting to watch, but people are so thirsty to be told this message.
Yeah. And for good reason. I wanted to ask, because I know that a large part of your work is based on outreach to and providing support for, as you were just talking about, transgendered people and the people who love them and care about them. And things have gotten, within the past half a year or so, they've gotten markedly worse. I think in our country for political reasons, for transgendered people and their families and loved ones. And I'm curious to hear about what are the kind of challenges that you're hearing about from people, and what kind of support then are you reaching out with?
Boy, the challenges are many and varied, and you can feel a bit overwhelmed if uh, I feel overwhelmed if I look too broadly. We have a lot of transgender friends that are online. Um, and the legal actions that are taking place all over the country, from
Yeah.
everything from kids in sports, kids in bathrooms. Declan was telling me about I think it was a proposed law, although I don't recall the details of where and when, that girls who wanted to play a sport, they would have to uh, track their menstruation on some sort of an app in order to prove
Oh,
their
oh,
right. So everything from that to trans people's rights in military, access to healthcare. I mean, it's one thing after another, and meanwhile, there's a demonization. I keep using that word, but I don't know anything better to use, because that there's common buzzwords that are thrown around in the sort of anti-trans thinking. Grooming, right? That trans
yeah,
people are grooming children, and that are pedophiles, and
yeah,
all these, like, oh my God, people are just people who want to live their lives and just be who
yeah,
they are, just like you do, just like everyone does. And there's been this movement away from painting gay people the way that gay people used to be painted, and now trans people are the focus.
yeah.
So it's frightening, and the violence against trans people, and particularly trans women of color, is shockingly prevalent.
Yeah.
And people, I think, struggle with ideas of and realities of people who are different from them,
Mhm.
and feel the need to marginalize uh, and defend against differentness, which is kind of crazy to me.
Yeah, well, people tend to externalize what they're afraid of inside themselves. And that creates a range of dangers, from mischief to violence.
Mm.
And I think the word that people often use is othering, but I think
Yeah.
demonization is a good word, given the intensity and the amplification of the stereotyping and in many cases, the deliberate kind of construction of scapegoats and targets for that kind of anxiety that can become anger and a sense of grievance. And so I think demonization fits what's happening right now. And it only highlights just how important and how badly needed the kind of work that you're doing is, Suzanne. So I'm glad you're out there, and I'm glad that 150 million people, growing by leaps and bounds all the time, have somewhere to go, somewhere to look for
Yeah.
a sense of companionship, and also a way to affirm their own worth and their beloved quality. And that leads me to want to ask you about another of your books, The Path of Unlearning, which is such an
Mm.
intriguing title, which you describe as a faith deconstruction book. So please tell us about that.
Yes. Well, The Path of Unlearning is actually a series. So far, there's two books. Only one of them has been published. The first
Ah,
one is called Sleep or Awake, and the second one is called Awake and Rise.
ah,
But so Sleep or Awake is a we've been, this process of Christian faith deconstruction is broad sweeping in the culture right now, and is multifaceted. I realized a few years ago, as Declan and I were discussing this, that when I wrote Where True Love Is, that is a deconstruction book. That is an examination of what you believe, and saying, does it make sense to believe this? And not in a that God needs to make sense, or that the divine can be comprehended. That if there is a divine force, how could it possibly fit inside our brains, or fit
it-
inside a book, right? I
if
mean,
it's divine, almost by definition, it's not going to.
exactly. And so when you're deconstructing and thinking about what makes sense, it isn't that you need to have God make sense. It is that you need to embrace the idea that it can't make sense, that much of it can't make sense, and that you need to break down, I think, almost smash your own efforts to make things concrete, right? But in doing that, there is a lot of fear that there's a lot of instability and a lot of loss. People leave their churches.
Yeah.
People's social circles are often centered around a church community.
Yeah.
Their volunteer involvement, so many things of the way they self-identify, the way they interact with other people can be centered around a church community. And when you start questioning those things, you can experience a lot of loss and a lot of
Yeah.
fear. And at the bottom of it, what if you lose God? So Sleep or Awake was written, these were almost one book, and I decided to break them because different people are at different places on this path of unlearning. And Sleep or Awake is designed to be a gentle hand holding through some of these questions, to tell people that it's all right, and to reassure them that they can keep looking for and at something rich and beautiful and deep and large, while discarding the things that aren't those things.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what those books are intended to be.
Well, you're very eloquent on the process, Suzanne. So thank you for that. And from what you're describing to me, it sounds as though an incredibly helpful thing that you're doing there is describing that it is a process. And yeah, it can feel dangerous at times and can be filled with loss. But by describing that it is a process, that's reassuring in itself, that, the loss you feel is not the end point, that there is a process then of relearning that can settle in, and there's a community such as the one that you and Declan have formed, that you can become a part of, which is probably going to make you happier to be part of, because you will be able to be part of it without without sacrificing your thoughtfulness, your care, your compassion, your ability to respect everyone. And then the world becomes your community, doesn't it? So it's a bigger community that you can fit into. So those sound like
That's a great
books.
insight. That's a great insight.
Well, I want to shift gears a little bit, because in the PR material you sent me, I know you have terriers and you have a cat named Chicken. And you wrote what I think is a children's book, given the title, about them, because it's called The Rumple Pimple Adventures. So tell us about the dogs and the chicken in the children's book.
Yes, absolutely. So Chicken's name is really Anastasia Butterscotch DeWitt Hall. However,
that is always going to have a nickname. That's always going to have a shortened version.
There you go. And, one day I was calling her, I like kitchens and I like kittens, and so one day I called her Chicken, and it just stuck. I have no idea why. That's Chicken. She came first. And then when we first moved to Newburyport, we got Rumple Pimple, who is a wire fox terrier. And anyone who knows wire fox terriers know what an interesting challenge. They're extremely smart. They're extremely stubborn. They're very strong-willed.
High energy.
And high energy. So he drove us a little crazy, but we loved him. And we decided that I wanted to tell a story that showed that included a diverse family without it being a message book, right? At that time, so this is probably 8 or 9 years ago. At that time, there was Heather Has Two Mommies and a few books, kids' books were out there, but we didn't need to have that conversation anymore, right? So Rumple Pimple just happened to have two moms, and he would go off on an adventure. His moms didn't really understand him that well, and he would get himself in trouble, but he was always saving the day. So in the first Rumple Pimple adventure, and they're all based on real things that happened with the actual Rumple Pimple. So Rumple Pimple was driving me crazy when I was trying to work. And so Declan took him for a ride to Market Basket in Newburyport, and because he loved rides. And when Declan opened the door, Rumple Pimple jumped across and ran across the parking lot as Declan is watching, horrified and terrified. He ran up to the motion activated door, ran into Market Basket, and disappeared. So Declan goes in and is looking around madly. Someone says, "Are you looking for a dog?" Declan says, "Yes." He says, "Went down aisle 4." So Declan goes after Rumpelpimple, finds him standing up sniffing at the meat counter in the butcher's
Of
section.
course.
So I fictionalized this real thing that happened because it was so crazy. And that there's a child who is crying because a bully is trying to take away her blanket while the two mothers are, doing the yabber yabber in the grocery store, not paying a lot of attention to this interaction. And Rumpelpimple rushes in, saves the day, tugs the blanket. And of course, mom flies in. She's upset because why did you come in here? She doesn't understand. And so, my goal is to tell a silly story, to have it be a diverse family, and to recognize that kids often feel misunderstood even when they're trying to do the right thing. So that's and now there's Philip. Philip wasn't around back when this book was written, but
okay, I'll be reading that. Well, Suzanne, thank you so much. It's been just wonderful and revelatory to talk to you. So I appreciate that. And I appreciate all the writing that you do, both your novel, and I'm glad to hear there's a second one coming out, and all of the work that you do, being a helpful, wise presence yourself. Sure that you've been very impactful on many, many people's lives. So thank you for all of that. So let's remind people about the event that's coming up on October 14th at St. Paul's at 7 p.m. Did I read there'll be snacks?
Oh, always snacks. There'll be wine and snacks, maybe a snack that's featured in the book. Stay tuned for that. And Jabberwocky Books will be on hand to provide books for people who want them.
And for people who would like more information about Suzanne's writing and her other work, please tell us about your website.
Sure. So my author website is sdewitthall, like my name.com. And the Where True Love Is movement. Just look for Where True Love Is on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all those places you can find us.
Well, thank you so much, Suzanne. I really appreciate your taking the time to visit the show. I've loved talking to you and have learned much. And I wish you the best with your book launch. I hope you have sell oodles and noodles of books, and best wishes with your other work that you do, creating more justice in the world. So thank you for taking time to visit the morning show.
Thank you so much, Mary. It's been a pleasure.
And my pleasure. Well, that's it for today, everybody. Thanks for watching and listening. Please join us again next Thursday at 9 a.m. for the morning show. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.